Look around any room full of people, and roughly 9 out of 10 of them will reach for a pen, a cup, or a doorknob with their right hand, without a single moment of thought about it. That ratio isn't a modern habit, and it isn't something taught in school. It shows up in every human culture ever studied, on every continent, in societies that write left to right, and societies that write right to left, in places with electricity and places without it. Researchers have looked for a culture anywhere on the planet where handedness splits differently, closer to 50-50, or even reverses toward the left, and haven't found one. Whatever is producing that lopsided 9-to-1 ratio isn't coming from any single culture's habits or tools. It's coming from somewhere far more fundamental, which raises an obvious question: where does a split like that actually come from, and how far back does it really go? Further back than you'd probably guess. A researcher named David Frayer went looking for evidence of handedness somewhere you'd never expect to find it: scratch marks on ancient teeth. Neanderthals routinely used their own front teeth as a kind of third hand, gripping a piece of food or hide between their teeth while cutting it with a stone tool held in one hand. That repeated pulling and cutting motion left faint diagonal scratches on the tooth enamel, and the angle of those scratches reveals which hand was doing the cutting. Frayer examined teeth from 35 different Neanderthal individuals spanning roughly 130,000 to 30,000 years ago, and found 32 of them showed right-hand dominant scratch patterns. That's over 90%, matching almost exactly the same ratio found in humans walking around today. This wasn't a trait that showed up recently, alongside handwriting or scissors or classroom desks built for right-handed students. It was already locked in, at close to the same lopsided ratio, in a completely different human species tens of thousands of years before anyone alive today's ancestors even existed. What makes this evidence especially convincing is how indirect it is. Nobody was trying to document handedness when those scratches were made. A Neanderthal wasn't posing for the fossil record. Each scratch is simply the leftover physical trace of an ordinary repeated task done the same way thousands of times over one individual's life, the same way you might wear a groove into a favorite tool's handle without ever meaning to. That makes it a genuinely reliable signal, not a guess based on artwork or written records, since Neanderthals left neither. So handedness itself is ancient, but why right-handed specifically, and why so consistently? The most compelling answer connects hand dominance to something that seems completely unrelated at first: language. An archaeologist named Natalie Uomini tested this connection directly, using a brain imaging technique that tracks blood flow to measure which side of the brain is working hardest during a task. She had volunteers perform 2 very different activities: making a stone tool in the style of ancient hand axes and generating words in a language task. Making a hand axe isn't a simple motion. It requires planning a whole sequence of precise strikes in a particular order, each one setting up the shape for the next. Very similar in structure to how a sentence requires words arranged in a particular sequence to make sense. What she found was striking. Both tasks lit up the same side of the brain, using strikingly similar patterns of activity. Her interpretation is that toolmaking and language may have evolved together, sharing overlapping neural circuitry, possibly reaching back as far as 2 million years to the earliest hand axe technology. If that's right, then the left hemisphere didn't independently decide to specialize in both fine motor sequencing for tool use and the fine sequential structure of language. The 2 skills may have grown up together, tangled into the same physical piece of brain tissue, each one reinforcing why the other stayed lateralized to that same side. And if language and right-hand dominance really did evolve together in the brain, you'd expect that connection to show up somewhere even deeper than behavior. It does, in the genes themselves. A team led by researcher Akira Wiberg, working at Oxford, ran a massive genetic study on roughly 400,000 people, comparing their genomes against whether they were left or right-handed. For the first time, this research identified specific genetic regions that reliably differ between left and right-handed people. Those regions turned out to be tied to genes involved in building microtubules, the internal scaffolding that shapes how brain cells grow and connect during development. Even more directly relevant, the same genetic variants were linked to differences in the brain's white matter tracts, the long-distance cabling that connects different brain regions to each other, specifically including the tracts running between the brain's language processing areas. In other words, the actual DNA behind which hand you favor is wired directly into the same biological hardware responsible for building your capacity for language. This wasn't a study looking to confirm a pet theory about tools and language either. It was a broad genetic survey comparing hundreds of thousands of ordinary genomes, and the language-related connection is simply what the data happened to show once researchers went looking for it. Put all three pieces together, and a genuinely coherent story starts to form. Ancient teeth show the 90% right-handed ratio already locked in a different human species over 100,000 years ago. Brain imaging research shows toolmaking and language activating the same side of the brain in living people today, and large-scale genetics shows the actual genes tied to handedness are wired into the same developmental machinery that builds the brain's language circuitry. None of these three findings on their own would be fully convincing. Together, they point at something bigger than a coin flip trait or a cultural convention passed down through scissors and school desks. Right-handedness looks like a kind of fossil signature, left behind by whatever process first pushed early hominins toward complex tool use and complex communication at the same time, using the same crowded piece of brain tissue to do both. That also means the roughly 10% of people who are left-handed aren't an error or a random deviation from some intended design. They're a stable minority pattern that has apparently persisted at almost exactly this same rate across the entire span of human evolution, right alongside the right-handed majority, for reasons researchers are still actively working out. One idea worth mentioning: if the whole point of strong lateralization is efficiency, dedicating one hemisphere fully to a task rather than splitting the job between both, then a species entirely made of right-handers might actually be less flexible as a group than a species with a small, stable minority doing things the mirrored way. A pure 90-10 split, holding steady for hundreds of thousands of years across an entire species, doesn't look like noise. It looks like a ratio evolution settled into and then kept, generation after generation, presumably because something about that specific balance worked. None of this means every last detail of the theory is settled. Researchers are still debating exactly how much of the story is toolmaking driving language, language driving toolmaking, or both developing together in a feedback loop neither one could have produced alone. But the three separate lines of evidence, fossil teeth, live brain imaging, and raw genetics, are remarkably hard to explain any other way once you look at them side by side. A cultural habit wouldn't leave scratch marks on 100,000-year-old Neanderthal teeth. A coincidence wouldn't consistently light up the same hemisphere for two seemingly unrelated tasks in a modern brain scanner, and random chance wouldn't repeatedly land on genes that happen to sit inside the exact wiring that connects the brain's language centers to each other. Whatever the full explanation turns out to be, the next time you catch yourself reaching for something without thinking about which hand moved first, you're looking at a genuinely ancient piece of behavior, one that was already fully formed hundreds of thousands of years before anyone thought to ask why, quietly built into the same stretch of brain tissue that also happens to be doing the work of turning your thoughts into words.